everyone is joining, I want to thank you for joining us tonight for the Christofferson Center Book Club Speaker Series on the front line of change, positive acts and planning. I'm Gretchen Worth, the project director of the Susan Christofferson Center for Community Planning, which organizes this series. The Christofferson Center works across New York State to support communities in planning for a more equitable, climate-resilient built environment. And we've introduced this series as a way to offer conversation around New York State planning challenges and opportunities. So tonight's program, Zoning, is informed by Arbitrary Lines, how zoning broke the American city and what we can do to fix it, written by M. Nolan Gray. And we're delighted to have Sara Bronin here to discuss the book and zoning generally. Sara wears a lot of hats, which you will hear about soon, and among them is founder of the National Zoning Atlas, which she'll tell you more about during the program. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping details. Please keep yourselves muted so everyone can hear the conversation. We are recording the event and we'll share that out to everyone who's registered. And we will keep this event to an hour, and hopefully we'll have time for your questions and comments at the end. So please feel free to participate over the next hour through the chat function. And we will incorporate as many of your questions as we can toward the end of the evening. This is our final book and speaker event for the season, and we'll be back in the fall with more great books and conversations relevant to planning in New York State. So if you're not already on our mailing list, you can sign up at christoffersoncenter.org, and you'll be kept up to date on our various events and news. Although we're joined tonight by people from across and beyond New York State, I'm based in Ithaca, and I would like to acknowledge that Ithaca is on the traditional homelands of the Guy-Cahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Guy-Cahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Guy-Cahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Guy-Cahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So thank you all so much for being with us tonight. I want to introduce Jeff Chusid, who's our moderator for the evening. In addition to his role as a founder and advisory board member of the Christofferson Center, Jeff is Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University School of Architecture, Art, and Planning, where he served as chair of the Department of City and Regional Planning from 2017 to 2021. Jeff is a preservation architect and planner with research interests that include the fate of historic resources in areas of conflict, the conservation of modernist architecture in India, historic cements, and sustainable development. His writings can be found in journals, museum catalogs, and several texts. Jeff has consulted on public policy, resource conservation, and urban design for diverse communities in China, Ukraine, Fiji, Texas, and elsewhere. And tonight we're focusing a little closer to home. So Jeff, I'll hand it over to you to introduce Sara and get us started.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. Well, it's a pleasure to be joined this evening by Professor Sara Bronin, who is a colleague in the Department of City and Regional Planning, and also has an appointment in the College of Law at Cornell. Sara has been involved with efforts to understand and improve zoning for years, from when she was chair of Hartford, Connecticut's Planning and Zoning Commission and a faculty member at the University of Connecticut School of Law, to her current major research project, the National Zoning Atlas, to her forthcoming book on zoning, The Key to the City, which is due from W.W. Norton this fall. So this evening, I'm going to summarize some key themes and arguments from the book, Arbitrary Lines, by M. Nolan Gray, and then ask Professor Bronin to share a bit about her work with the National Zoning Atlas as a prelude to a conversation about Gray's book and the future of zoning. Gray, by the way, is currently a doctoral student in planning at UCLA, prior to which he worked for some years as a planner in the city of New York, and then as a research fellow at the Mercator Center at George Mason University. So what is zoning? Gray states that zoning is not to be confused with the broader field of city planning, as zoning is only a tool whose purpose is to segregate land uses and control density. Further, Gray maintains that zoning is relatively new, invented in its current form at the beginning of the 20th century, while cities have been around for millennia, and Gray would argue doing fine without it. Arbitrary Lines expands this brief history of zoning, noting that it arose in the 19-teens out of a perhaps unexpected collaboration between progressives seeking to free cities from the corruption of bossism, Tammany Hall, etc., by introducing a rational mechanism for regulating development, and specific groups with local agendas, which were often discriminatory. Gray cites the Supreme Court decision that validated zoning, in which a justice called apartment buildings parasites that would eventually destroy a neighborhood. From 1922 to 26, the federal government got on board, helping to craft model zoning ordinances, and within a few years, all states had enabling legislation that enabled municipalities to zone, and zone they did. But rather than being a tool of good planning, Gray argues that zoning, from the beginning, was in reality a mechanism of exclusion designed to inflate property values, slow the pace of new development, segregate cities by race and class, and enshrine the detached single-family house as the exclusive urban ideal. Further, Gray asserts that, ironically, for a process that was supposed in part as a way to remove urban development from political bosses and make it rational, even scientific, most zoning decisions in cities today are discretionary, firmly politicizing the process and making it susceptible to all the undue influences of the old boss system. Gray goes on to detail his arguments against zoning, beginning with economics. In already built-out cities, he writes, zoning makes it prohibitively difficult to build more housing. The mechanisms for keeping housing expensive include, first, density limitations, second, qualitative standards, such as lot size, parking requirements, etc., and third, a review process that takes time and money. In most American cities, single-family detached homes are not just the dominant allowable zoning, but other forms of housing are almost impossible to construct. In San Jose, California, for instance, apartment buildings are illegal in 94% of the city. When did zoning become such a problem for the production of affordable housing? Gray suggests that the answer is the home voter hypothesis. When housing became the major investment and source of wealth in America, most homeowners voted in ways that they believed maintained or increased home value. Gray says that this is a phenomenon that took root in the 1960s and 70s and has only gotten worse with the financialization of the housing markets and other economic factors. As a result, zoning has become a structure to protect home value first and foremost, rather than a mechanism to foster the growth and development of cities. In fact, Gray argues zoning now tends to stifle growth and development, including growth that fosters innovation. Gray also blames zoning and the resultant high cost of housing for the fact that more and more Americans are moving from more to less productive cities. Agglomeration economies, cities that prosper due to multiple and diverse activities and peoples, are at risk from tight zoning. Gray cites figures in the trillions of dollars for lost growth and income in cities that have essentially maxed out their zoning. And people are no longer moving to where the jobs and opportunities are. They can't afford to, but to cities that are cheaper and less restrictive. But these are also typically places with lower wages and fewer intellectual and entrepreneurial advantages. Density is another major factor in the efficient use of our nation's energy resources. Sprawl, of course, forces long commutes and reliance on the automobile, and single-family residential zones with their low density and absence of uses such as services, entertainment, and jobs are the definition of sprawl. Below a certain density, it's not feasible to build a mass transit system, and when distances are great enough, alternatives such as bicycles are infeasible as well. This isolates children and individuals and families without one or more automobiles, further diminishing their lives and opportunities, in effect, imposing a tax on both people and communities. Gray then turns to where many of us have been focused when it comes to zoning impacts, at least since the publication of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and that is its use in segregating American cities by both race and class. He notes that cities that adopted zoning before 1930, by 1970, were significantly more racially and economically segregated than cities that didn't. In brief, zoning is the most effective segregation tool ever devised, Gray writes, and its use in this way has left American cities struggling to provide equal facilities, opportunities, and access to goods and services. After these critiques, Gray offers 4 recommendations for what he calls less bad zoning. First, eliminate single-family zoning. Second, abolish minimum parking requirements. Third, lower or eliminate minimum floor area and lot size requirements. And fourth, decriminalize affordable housing typologies such as single-room occupancies, accessory dwelling units, group housing, and the like. In fact, many of these recommendations are being adopted by cities around the US today, including Minneapolis, Seattle, Austin, San Diego, etc. Still, for Gray, that is not really good enough. He goes on to argue for abolishing zoning altogether, writing that zoning often defends coded community desires that don't deserve state preferences or support. He cites the often used phrase community character that for him stands in for race and class segregation. Gray notes that zoning is often delinked from or not critical to city planning. In many cities, it exists even though no comprehensive plans have been developed that are supposed to provide a justification for zoning decisions. And lastly, he argues that the stability and rational basis supposedly ensured by zoning is undercut by the increasing use of discretionary zoning, variances, overlay zones, and other complications in the system or the process. The classic example of a city without zoning is Houston, Texas. Gray notes several characteristics that he believes contribute to making it a dynamic, growing, and most importantly for him, affordable place. He cites the way that covenants and other deed restrictions take the place of zoning, but operate at a much more local level and in a way that allows the property owners more say about what rules to promulgate and enforce. Gray writes that these covenants also have to be popular or homes won't sell. And these pockets of self-government, the neighborhoods with shared deed restrictions on things such as density, height, landscape, etc., take political pressure off the city to impose zoning more broadly. Gray also believes that cities naturally sort things out without the need for zoning to tell people where to build. Factories and warehouses cluster near highways and railroads, for example. Single-family homes populate hilly terrain, services located along busy roads. The real need for separation of uses has to do actually with protection from noxious externalities, noise, smells, lighting, and other environmental factors, along with certain specific uses, such as slaughterhouses, strip clubs, bars, and oil wells not being put near homes or schools. These can be controlled by specific nuisance ordinances targeting the problem, along with adequate enforcement. Gray believes. Beyond that, he also believes that many conflicts can be solved by mediation, by the parties meeting and working together to arrive at a resolution, and by focusing planning on more critical issues that would support economic and social development, such as transportation, parks, infrastructure, and community services. Gray makes some perhaps questionable assertions, which is understandable in a book written for a general audience as well as for his peers. For instance, he calls accessory dwelling units cheap and easy to build. That might be the case for a garage conversion, But there is research that suggests it is quite expensive to build standalone units, hence not likely that they will be particularly affordable. But more critically, Gray seems to assume that all the players are local and engaged in their community. In fact, an increasing percentage of single-family homes and other properties are owned by real estate investment trusts or by franchise operators or other speculators, some of whom may be located in other countries, let alone other states or towns. As some reviewers of the book note, and Professor Bronin writes in her forthcoming work, Houston's lack of zoning also renders some neighborhoods, especially communities of color, largely powerless in the face of decisions by those outside players or more powerful vested interests. Still, Arbitrary Lines is readable, smart, and serious about trying to address and correct what many would agree is a system that needs fixing, and raises some great questions for our conversation this evening. And so with that, I'd like to invite Professor Bronin to share her thoughts on the book and then introduce the National Zoning Atlas.
Hey, everybody. I really appreciate, Jeff, your comments, and thank you to Gretchen and the Christofferson Center for including me here today. So I'm one of Jeff's colleagues up at Cornell, and focus on zoning laws, as he said. And reading Nolan's book was really fascinating to me as well. I think, Jeff, your critiques are spot on. One of the things that I wish Nolan was more optimistic about the power of zoning to positively shape our lives. I do think that he's an excellent, insightful critic of zoning, but I think that there are some things that can redeem zoning. And one of those places where I think we might differ is Houston, which, as Jeff said in the book, he applauds for its relative lack of land use regulations. As he points out, there are covenants and other private land use controls, as well as subdivision regulations that are at work. So it's not technically zoning. But I grew up in Houston, and in one of the neighborhoods where you had a fairly disjointed series of uses. So where my childhood home was, I went back there fairly recently and saw across the street was a nightclub. Just to the left was a gas station. Just to the right was a self-storage facility, and low-lying strip malls right next to a place where multifamily housing and families were raising their children in a largely immigrant and predominantly Spanish-speaking community. So that neighborhood in Houston, Gulfton, as it's called, I think exemplifies what Jeff was just saying about the potential for zoning to create more orderly land uses for people of all different economic backgrounds. So I know Nolan personally. He is extremely intelligent, so much insights on zoning law as it developed, on zoning and its effects now. And in his leadership role at the California Yes in My Backyard organization, he's been able to shape policy in one of the states that's been most active in zoning. So I think while his book pushes in the against zoning direction, that was the original title that he had conceived, and does urge for us to abolish zoning altogether, I know for a fact that he does end up working quite a bit in the system as we have it today, which is the system, as he describes, of states passing laws that allow local governments to enact zoning, and enact zoning they do. So with that sort of background and bias, and again, perhaps a bit more optimism about zoning than Nolan has, I thought I might say a few words about a research project that Jeff has supported as my colleague at Cornell, and that I'm excited to talk about today, because I think it really raises the question, at least for me, of and the project is called the National Zoning Atlas, but it raises the question for me of how does Nolan know anything about zoning, and how do any of us know? So as zoning is set up in this country, there are 30,000 different towns all around the country that have zoning. What that means is that unless you've read every single zoning code, you don't necessarily know what zoning as a whole means. And actually, a lot of what he says in the book, generalizing about single family housing and minimum lot sizes, it does hold true. And it does hold true based on the work of our project so far, but we've learned a lot of nuances in our project, which, as noted here, is really a collaborative project that is digitizing, demystifying, and democratizing US zoning codes. So what is the National Zoning Atlas? It's online, by the way, at zoningatlas.org, if any of you want to pull that up while I'm speaking. It is a map that shows how places zone. It is a way for us to calculate how certain land is subject to certain rules. So here you can see we have a little filter that says, show me where people can build. And I use Providence, Rhode Island here because it has a lot of different uses. But when you click on show me where people can build apartments, you can see pretty clearly they can build apartments in downtown Providence and then along the commercial corridors that go alongside. It also enables us, because of the way we take zoning information from each city, to compare cities to each other. So on the Zoning Atlas, we've done Metro Las Vegas, Metro Jacksonville, Metro Baltimore, and we're able to see how much residential land allows for single family housing, how much has a parking requirement, how big the minimum lot sizes are, and more. I do want to give a shout out to our team of 19 full-time people who work on the project. We have our leadership team, half on the zoning code side, half on the geospatial side. And we have zoning code analysts that look at the text of the codes, geospatial analysts who look at the maps. And in fact, I'm actually going to jump ahead here to just say zoning is a combination of text and map. Here you see Baltimore. Baltimore has a large number of districts. This is a simplified version of their map, and they have a zoning code that's several hundred pages long. So my team looks at the text of the zoning code and looks at the maps to try to standardize it. Now, going back just to say where we are in the Atlas right now, we have covered land that is home to 75 million Americans. We have about 6,000 jurisdictions in progress. We have 4,000 jurisdictions that have been posted to the Atlas, and we have had about 320 contributors to date. So just wanted to say a quick word about how we make it. So I talked about zoning text and map. We have this guide called How to Make a Zoning Atlas, and we extract information about individual zoning districts within a jurisdiction, and we have a sort of a very standardized way to do that. We put that information into what we call the zoning editor, and then we make the information accessible to the public through the map. I'd be interested to know, if folks want to put in the chat, how many districts you think the city of Ithaca has, which some of us may have in common. If you want to put a guess in the chat, happy to take a look as I'm speaking. But the number of zoning districts can vary quite significantly from one city or town to another. And we've seen places with as few as 5 zoning districts to the city of Boston, which has over 400, which is exactly why it's not yet up in the Atlas. The information we collect includes single-family housing, multifamily housing, accessory dwelling units, which Jeff just brought up, which could be garage apartments, it could be third story, tucked into the eaves. It could be a caretaker's unit in a factory, actually. We log non-residential uses, minimum lot sizes, minimum parking requirements, and we do that for each and every district. Now, seeing that no one ventured a guess as to Ithaca, I'll let you know that Ithaca, a tiny jurisdiction compared to, let's say, a New York City or a Boston, nonetheless still has 53 zoning districts. So to understand how the city of Ithaca zones, you either have to understand how to read the zoning code and connect it to the map and then figure out what all the cross permitting is, or you can go to our map. I do want to say some of the findings are available in my book. So Jeff, I just got this cover image in. I'm super excited about it. But I want to turn really quickly to the map itself. And so I'm going to actually show you one of the very first jurisdictions that we put up in the national map, and that is Ithaca. So this is what you see, Ithaca and the surrounding area. So this is what you see when you log into the map. You can go to New York, and you can actually see here, we've done Long Island as well. We're starting in Westchester County, but you can see these areas between Binghamton and Syracuse that we've started to do. And as you zoom in, you can check out our legend here, which shows that, so the gray are areas that we know do not have zoning. This might be of interest to those of you who have been involved in discussions in Caroline and elsewhere. And then the jurisdictions that do have zoning are purple. So again, just to give you a quick glimpse, here we are in Binghamton. You still see, even though you consider Binghamton to be, a somewhat multi-use city, lots of this light purple, which suggests that it's primarily residential. As you zoom in to Ithaca, I'm actually going to pick Ithaca specifically to zoom into, again, just for kicks. You can see that the areas here are a little bit more mixed. So the darker purple is mixed with residential. This area here, the university, is non-residential. Even though there are dorms, we don't count them as residential. And it might interest you to know where in Ithaca you can build single-family homes. And actually, you can see it's much of Ithaca. If you look at the bottom right, you can see that 73% of land allows for single-family housing, which might be something that you don't expect from the local college town. When we turn here to where apartments are allowed as of right, you see 38%, and this is just Ithaca City, so 38% of land allows for apartment units. This is a figure that's very, very different if we pick a suburban jurisdiction. Let's try to zoom up maybe somewhere around Syracuse, where you might see, some of the towns. You see Syracuse itself with a lot of multifamily housing allowances, but you see towns around it with much less compared to the area. And certainly when I click on single family housing compared to the area available for single family housing. So I thought this tour might help, and I'll go back to our home screen here, and I'm going to turn off these tribal and protected layers. I think what we're trying to do with the zoning atlas is to paint a story across the country of how these 30,000 jurisdictions zone. So we can really get into some of the more refined research. Nolan cites all the best research on zoning that we have right now, but we don't have a tool like this that would compare places to each other and really get to the bottom of the sort of trends that we see. In Connecticut, for example, we found that across the state, the minimum lot size is 1 acre or more for 80% of land, residential land in the state. We see much smaller lot sizes in California. We see big lot sizes in Montana. Along the Houston and Texas Gulf Coast, sometimes we see no minimum lot sizes at all. Nashville, New Orleans, Raleigh, these are very different across the country. So I'm going to stop sharing with that, just, having given you a glimpse of the project that we are working on, and hope that it helps to raise questions, to ground truth some of the things that we see in Nolan's book, and some of the things that the case that I try to make in my book, which is a little bit more of an optimistic case about zoning. So I think with that, Jeff, I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Wonderful project, and thank you for that introduction. One comparison that Nolan makes is actually with, interestingly, Japan, where he tries to say that it has a less restrictive zoning realm than we do. And when you mention the 53 zoning districts in Ithaca, he mentions that all of Japan has 12 zoning districts. So
That's amazing, isn't it?
It is kind of shocking. I think it might be helpful to look a little bit more at why I mean, we've stated it, but why you started the zoning atlas, why Nolan is writing what he is writing, why you wrote what you're writing. In other words, to talk a little bit more about what's gone wrong and why these things are being done and what might be useful about it.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, so zoning is so important, and yet we know very little about it. And I think that motivated both Nolan and myself to first start on the study of zoning early in our careers. As you mentioned, he's a doctoral student, rounding the bend on a PhD. I've been studying zoning ever since I was in law school. I think the fascinating part of it is that it dictates almost everything that we see around us. And yet, oftentimes it goes unquestioned once a zoning code has been written. And so for both of us, I think we feel that more people should understand what zoning is and what its impact on our lives is now and could be later if we revise it and reform it for the better.
It's great. One of the things that he talks about, and I'm sure you do in your book as well, a little bit is the less bad version of zoning, or to use an optimistic phrase, how we might address some of these things with different zoning. And I think it's interesting to know that he uses the phrase tight zoning to mean zoning in which only one use is permitted. And I know from my own research, for instance, in the city of Austin, it used to be back in the 70s, the city with the best affordable housing index in the country. And then by 2000, it was the most expensive city that wasn't on a coast. And it's always been a boom town, although obviously that's part of it. But one of the things that changed was that before 1984, housing could exist in any district, industrial, commercial, or residential. Commercial could exist in any district, commercial or industrial. Industrial only in industrial. After 1984, housing could only exist in a housing district. And so the ability to have housing mixed in with, and admittedly perhaps less desirable in some ways, but more affordable in many other ways, has changed by isolating and protecting this. I know New York City was trying to maintain industrial zoning in parts of Long Island because they were worried that housing has such an economic clout that these days it would displace any industrial activity. But still, you in Hartford were working to make a much more nuanced and mixed use kind of zoning accessible and available. So do you want to talk about how you think about, or how one approaches this question of mixing uses in coming up with a new zoning guidance?
Sure. I think, as you point out, well, even before zoning, there was a pretty vibrant mix of uses because there weren't the kind of land use rules that zoning brought starting in the 1920s, but really accelerating through the 1950s. Lots of the codes that we see today were revisions of earlier, a century ago, 80-year ago codes that were adopted in the 1950s and 1960s. And those codes are very typically separating the kind of uses that you talk about. So housing, industrial, commercial, retail, and so on. There are really good reasons to separate noxious industrial uses from residential areas. That was one of the original purposes and justifications of zoning back in the 1910s and 1920s. But the justification for separating residential uses from retail and office and recreational facilities and uses is not as clear. When you look at those cities where people want to live, where they pay the most money to live, those kinds of historic neighborhoods in highly complicated and dense cities, the Greenwich Villages, the Beacon Hills, the Georgetowns here in Washington, D.C., people pay money to live in those neighborhoods in part because they can walk to so many different things and so many different kinds of things. That's not to say that there's house, store, house, office, house, other use and so on. But that is to say that there is a more organic sense with corner stores and again, walkable retail and office space just beyond. And I think those kinds of mixed use communities can be very beneficial to a more diverse group of people to live in. But unfortunately, those are the communities that people actually want to pay for and are the most expensive in many cases because they're so rare. So zoning has played a role in separating land uses to such an extreme that we have shot ourselves in the foot in terms of, I guess, healthy and well-connected communities. It is the case, and I know it's the case in and around lots of Ithaca, that we have to drive to get anywhere. We have to drive from home to the library, to the religious institution, to the grocery store. We don't have those kinds of integrated communities. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, that's a choice that people are making too, to live out, in beautiful upstate New York and to have that scenery. And, but I think, in other cases, what has happened is zoning has created and constrained the market and constrained market choices by mandating that kind of development in far too many places. If you dig down into our atlas and you look at the minimum lot size requirements, for example, I already told you in Connecticut, 80% of land, I think I mentioned, or maybe I mentioned it just before, was 80% of land in Connecticut has a 1 acre minimum lot size. That's almost the size of a football field for a single house. And that's 80% of residential land in Connecticut. So again, it begs the question, if we are, if we care about the environment, if we care about farmland and forest and their preservation, how do we balance that with good zoning that it creates more mixed communities where we might do more walking than driving? That's, I think, the aspiration and the potential promise of zoning, but I think it starts with the idea that mixed use communities can be beneficial to us, not just to us as individuals, but more broadly to the way that we develop our nation.
I think it's interesting looking back, the advantage of being around a while, but I remember as a student in architecture school, one of the really important books was The Uses of Disorder by Richard Sennett, which came out in 1970 and basically was essentially a call for, among other things, getting rid of regulatory regimes such as zoning and replacing it with a kind of anarchistic response, anarchism being the libertarianism of the day. In many ways, it was a response to kind of the stultifying social norms of the 1950s and 60s that was being played out in the environment. Then there are form-based codes that came out about 30 years ago now, which have really sought to address not just the mix of uses, but also, aesthetic aspects, density, and other aspects of the city. And then we have the current discussion that Nolan and Sara exemplify, which attempts to look at zoning again with the idea of change, but based on perhaps much more understanding of the kind of facts and figures or what the consequences have been of zoning as we see it. So I'm it does seem like the debate has been around for a long time, but the focus and the tools for maybe making the debate have an impact on actual zoning has, I guess, evolved or become more sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, you've characterized that evolution pretty well. I think I mean, just on the point of, I mean, what about this is sophisticated? I think Nolan raises the point about how decisions are made, and the fact that, sometimes decisions are made fairly piecemeal. In other words, maybe they're not so well informed. I don't think he's a huge fan of form-based codes in particular, because he views them as adding regulation. And I think that's this, if what we see in what we've been doing in our National Zoning Atlas is tracking a figure that could be a proxy for complexity, in addition to the number of zoning codes, the number of pages in zoning code texts. So we've seen zoning codes as long as 4,000 pages, just to give you a sense. And you wonder, is a 4,000 page zoning code really something that has even the kind of coherent philosophy that you were just describing as codes have evolved? Or at that point, is it just a ship with a lot of barnacles that somebody has sort of piecemealed and put on over time? I don't know, that's what when you said the word sophisticated, started thinking about just the balance between sophistication with data-driven decisions, with arbitrariness, which I do acknowledge as something Nolan points out is real.
Yeah. Well, I think by sophistication, I'm hoping that I'm talking more about the way that the information gathered in efforts like yours might inform a better alternative code.
That's the theory. But if you look at the history of the way that zoning codes have been reformed, they have not always been well informed by data. I mean, if you take the way that zoning codes shifted in the 1950s, a lot of the information that was passed from one zoning jurisdiction to another was that we have to make it was car oriented. We have to make it easier to move cars throughout our city. And so they added things like minimum parking requirements, which would require each individual property owner to build parking spaces. They added things like garage requirements to build a garage. They added provisions on lot coverage, which would, again, require you to minimum lot size to accommodate driving. And they allowed for uses, and we did this in Hartford along Albany Avenue, one of our actually on multiple avenues within Hartford, Connecticut, allowing car washes and gas stations to proliferate and fast food joints to proliferate, even though allowing that meant that much of the great architecture of Hartford along the avenues was torn down and turned into, strip malls and really unattractive development. So, hopefully the National Zoning Atlas will inspire a wave of data-informed zoning, because I think it will help to support secondary research in a way that we haven't seen before. On the other hand, we don't have a great track record of that.
Right. We have a few minutes for questions if there are from the audience. One that's there is, will you be sharing some of your favorite zoning codes? Are you going to identify kind of normative models of code or ones that you think are more successful?
We've been asked about that. I don't think there is a single code that, other than Hartford's, that is ideal on all fronts. We think that probably at some point we will articulate some principles for drafting zoning codes. We might point to a few codes that have some of these principles. I think we as well, first of all, our zoning analysts, and in particular who are analyzing the text and our geospatial analysts, they love it when codes are simple. You know, if it's clear, if it's simple, in other words, if they can understand it easily. Sometimes you get just a sort of run-of-the-mill suburb somewhere that has a code that's 500 pages long, and then you wonder, why on earth do you need a 500-page long zoning code and all of these sub-districts that are meticulously outlined? For us, in some ways, simpler is better. And so I think our team could come up with some of those. We've seen zoning codes from 30 years ago that are scanned in paper documents. We've seen zoning codes that are only available if you pay. We've seen jurisdictions that don't even, that we have 3 jurisdictions. If anybody knows Antonito, Colorado, Bailey's Prairie, Texas, and then Love Rock, Nevada, we don't have zoning codes from those 3 jurisdictions, and we can't get them. There's no way to get them from the towns. So, I mean, we've really run the gamut, and I think we will be writing up some of our observations because we already have a ton of jurisdictions under our belt. But I think we'll point more towards the broad principles for what makes a good code. And I think part of what makes a good code is that people can understand it. That's really key, because otherwise you can't engage with zoning, this really important local government power.
So that's great. There are a couple of other questions here. I'm looking at the chat. One is, do you have a timeline for the atlas, or is, and how do you manage zoning updates?
The timeline is as soon as we raise more money for analysts. I am a volunteer for the project. I always work for free because that's just my thing. But other people don't, I think, rise to the let me work full time analyzing tens of thousands of pages of zoning text over the course of the year. So we have to fund salaries. So we're, as soon as we get funding for a new jurisdiction or a new region, we hire a new zoning code analyst or geospatial analyst. And as you saw, we have a team of 19. Sometimes we have external teams that pop up to support our work. We started off with more external teams, but now we are doing more centralization just for project management and accuracy reasons. And so it's really a function of funding. I've calculated that if we have 70 analysts, 35 zoning code and 35 geospatial, we can get the whole project done in 2 years. They would be working full time. So if anybody out there has $15 million or so, that would be great to know.
Okay, everybody.
And just as for updates, we just on that one, one great way to keep track of updates to zoning codes, in addition to getting automated emails for each jurisdiction from Municode and similar, which we have not set up yet. But another way that we're going to explore when we have a tech fellow is to create a web scraping tool that will help us find electronic notices of zoning code meetings. And what that will do is it'll help us alert us as to when zoning codes change. Some zoning codes change not at all in decades. Others change every few weeks, especially in the big cities. We don't have an updating mechanism yet. We're just focused on breadth. But we know that our atlas has already led to change. It's already changed statewide zoning in Connecticut. In Montana, it's very likely to lead to reforms in New Hampshire as well. So we are tracking those, and then we just have to kind of find some folks on our team who have a spare few hours to devote to that. So that's not a pretty process, but that is definitely something that is on our mind, and we have some strategies for and and the team is fundraising for too.
Right. We have a question here which addresses both the negative the negative aspects of zoning that we've mentioned and that Nolan mentions, but also then asks, how does zoning become a tool to achieve goals that we want to collectively around environment and things like that, social community development? And is that really possible? And how do you arrive at a consensus around some of these? And just an example that we saw in the newspaper yesterday, New York City is expediting what they call green housing, um, housing of a particular size and affordability that's not located near a park, a historic district, or a flood zone is going to get an accelerated process and encouragement in some other ways. But how easy do you think it is to shift to this kind of proactive or progressive set of goals for zoning?
Yeah, and I do think that part of that is it's seeing what communities people like and figuring out what the zoning is in those communities. I used Georgetown as an example. The zoning in Georgetown is actually pretty unique in that it allows for single family and multifamily housing. It allows for corner stores. It allows for retail. It's kind of, the zoning has set the stage for the kind of connected community that I was talking about. Small towns have done the same thing, and you can look to see there's a small town in Idaho that has gotten famous because it eliminated minimum parking requirements in its downtown. I guess I would say zoning famous, not super famous. And their city manager wrote a story about it, and I cited it in my book. My book is on my mind because I just got, and I'll show you, I just got like the advanced proof copy of it, which is not corrected. So there are errors in it. So it's just like a copy to have for me. But that's exactly what my book covers. It covers, there's chapters on food security and how zoning can be a tool to enable community gardens, farmers markets. It covers housing security, of course, and the kinds of communities, the kinds of cities that are more progressive when it comes to housing policy. It covers the environment. One example that I love to, that I loved, and believe it or not, I found these examples just by reading zoning codes, because that's just what I do in my spare time. But comparing the zoning codes of Tucson, Arizona, and Scottsdale, Arizona. Tucson changed its zoning code years ago to ban grass and to require drought-resistant landscaping. So what did that do for the city of Tucson? It actually significantly reduced the water usage over a period of years, to the point where it's a fraction of Scottsdale, whose zoning code requires green lawns in arid, hot Arizona in the midst of a water shortage. We have a city, and many cities, I'm sure, beyond that, but that just happen to pick on them because they're the city where Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin West is located, which is a real counterpoint to the kind of development that you see across Scottsdale, more like the Tucson model than its surrounding suburb. But anyway, the point is that, so, it talks about environmental issues. There are cities that are creating strategies that are environmentally sustainable, that do promote active transportation, that do promote housing. And I think we should be learning from those and drawing from those bits and pieces in tandem with sort of the anecdotal and, pulling out specific examples on topics. I think that hopefully the National Zoning Atlas will help us. We're using the data to study sea level rise and in the New York City metro area, trying to figure out with a regional plan association where we are zoning for housing in areas that are prone to sea level rise. In other words, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. We are also looking at where schools and school quality and how that's affiliated with zoning. So zoning has a huge impact on the education system because it dictates who can live where. So, if you wonder why we have segregated schools, we wonder why we have segregated neighborhoods. It's because we have zoning rules. And I think in that sense, Nolan is right that zoning has, as currently written, not always been successful, but there are communities that are changing that. And I think that there's a lot more that we can learn. And the fact that you all are here on a weeknight chit-chatting about zoning is a first step in that, in opening people's eyes, I think, to the power of this important tool.
That's great. Thank you. Very quickly, because I know we're almost out of time, but I was struck by Nolan's point that zoning is often not tied to a comprehensive plan. And I'm wondering about and I think the priorities of a community need to be expressed in a comprehensive plan in order to justify what happens within a zoning.
So there are some states that have a requirement that zoning complies with the comprehensive plan. What our analyst just brought up in a meeting recently with our zoning atlas staff was that in those states with planning requirements, you see more jurisdictions that have adopted zoning, and you see longer and more complicated zoning codes. That's their sort of impression right now, based on when we have zoning analysts that have worked on multiple states. For example, California, which has lots and lots of statewide planning rules and mandates, has zoning codes that have many more multiples of districts more than other states, and almost universally has adopted zoning. So I think that's a really important question. We haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet, but it's a research question that I just started talking with Dr. Scott Markley, our geospatial coordinator, about, and I hope we'll see a little bit more on the relationship between zoning and planning and statewide zoning mandates and the adoption and the complexity of zoning fairly soon.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Sarah, I really appreciate you joining us this evening and sharing the remarkable work of the Atlas. And Gretchen, do you want to come in and say anything about upcoming things or the recording?
Well, first I'd love for Sarah to tell us when her book will be released.
The publication date is October 1st. It's out for pre-order now, so you can get it anytime, or you can hopefully pick it up in October. I will be in Ithaca as well, one of the weeks of October, to do a book talk at the law school. Hopefully AAP will co-sponsor that. I'd love to see some of you guys in person, and I'll do a more thorough talk about maybe the optimistic side of Nolan's coin, maybe live in Ithaca.
Fantastic. So thank you again to Sarah, thank you again to Jeff, and thank you all for joining us. We will resume our book speaker program in the fall, and so please do sign up for our mailing list if you're not already on it, so that you can get information about those fall events coming soon. So thank you all for joining. Have a really great summer, and we will see you in the fall. Thanks, everyone.